first of all, I would like to thank Carmen and Ludovic, obviously, for thinking of me and giving me the opportunity to present some ideas here today. I also want to say that I would love to give this talk in French, but I'm not that good. So, you know, my French is good for reading, but not really for speaking. So I prefer to give it in English. So I hope, you know, I can be clear on what I say. So today, I want to talk about an interesting process that we went through trying to solve one of the most interesting challenges in Mexican historical archaeology. And when I'm saying trying to solve, in reality, is just taking a substantial step towards solving, you know, one of the most interesting challenges in Mexican historical archaeology. And so this is to say, to imagine ways in which we could analyze one of the most difficult chapters in Mexican history that refers to how the arrival of the European to America in the process called the Conquest of America affected profoundly the ways of life of indigenous Mesoamerican societies. And we have been particularly interested in studying how the definition of territories, but also how the conceptions of space and place as well as landscape changed with the Spanish colonial rule. And this included also to imagine ways in which we could analyze how settlement patterns basically change at a larger scale. Because so far, although there has been local studies, of course, there has never been an analysis looking to understand larger regional patterns. And the reason has basically been that data was simply not available for this. So today, and I know that this is a more technical conference in a way, but in spirit of the spatial humanities, in the first part of the presentation, I want to talk about the historical questions and also the complexities behind their context, and how this basically gave birth to the idea of the creation of the first 16th century digital Gazetteer of Mexico that we carried out in the context of the Digging into Early Colonial Mexico project that Bruno was talking about. And so in the final part of the talk, I also want to walk you through the process that we went through creating these. And I'm particularly keen to communicate this because when we started this project, although historical gazetteers have been obviously created before this one, there was no documentation or best practice guides, for instance, that we could find available and that we could make use of, and that could help us basically in this process. So as a result of this project particularly, we have been able to create quite an interesting substantial data set. This is to say an historical gazetteer with more than 14,000 historical place names. But we have also documented very carefully every step of this process with the idea of providing information for those people that are interested in the creation of historical gazetteers and basically the lessons that we could give to people so you can basically learn from that experience, right? So I hope you find that interesting. So the first thing that I needed to say, and I want to emphasize here, and this is the motivation basically that lead us here, is that Mesoamerican indigenous groups such as the Aztec did not understand the world in a way that Western societies did and still do. So this is to say that they had a very different cosmovision. This means their vision of the cosmos or cosmogony, right? These differ from European societies in almost all aspects of life, beliefs, and organization. So where the Aztec believed in a multiplicity of gods and had a naturalistic view of the world, the Spanish had only one God and believed in the precepts of Christianity, right? And this is to say that the Aztec believed that all beings, but also all in the natural world, was connected, while the Spanish believed that humans were at the center of creation. And this distinction, despite that maybe at first glance seems not necessarily related to territoriality or the ways that a place is organized, it is of fundamental importance because systems of belief, of course, permeate everything. So what I'm talking about here is the next. When the Spanish arrived to central Mexico, what they basically see is a wonderful Aztec city called Tenochtitlan, which is today in the center of Mexico City, and that will become eventually as well the capital of the Spanish Empire in America. And this is built in the middle of a massive lake called the Lake Texcoco. And the Spanish immediately think of this city as the capital of central Mexico and the Aztec Empire, right? And it is, of course, not their fault that they think of this city as such, because in the European imaginary, Tenochtitlan is everything that the capital of a kingdom should be. It is a very well organized and impressive city. It is, as I said, in the middle of this massive lake, surrounded by canals that work as means for navigation. It has beautiful agricultural lots. There are impressive avenues basically connecting the island with the mainland. It is cleaned daily by dedicated cleaning crews. Every house has access to running water. It is superbly organized in neighborhoods, each with a temple and a market. The central market that is placed in the twin city Tlatelolco is visited by thousands of people from many different ethnic groups daily. And they come from places that range from the north of Mexico, what is today modern US, to Central America. And even it had basically 2 aquariums and a zoo, right? And its ceremonial temple, the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, is out of this world. It is a massive ritual center with a twin temple of more than 40 meters high, and it is dedicated to 2 of the most important Aztec deities, the god of rain, Tlaloc, and the god of sun and war, Huitzilopochtli. So in the Spanish understanding of the world, coming back to the cosmovision, they understood territorial organization as having a center and a periphery, the city and the countryside, the civilization and the wilderness, right? Very much as we conceive things in the West today. But in the Mesoamerican world, things, and particularly land, is not conceived in this way. Just to begin with, features in the landscape such as mountains, rivers, etc., are basically conceived as living entities. And mountains in particular have a sacred nature, and places like caves are liminal spaces that lead into the underworld, right? So in the Aztec view, humans were connected to all these things, not only through daily interactions, but also through the belief that the actual earth was a living being. And if this was the case, this is to say that we are interacting with living entities, we can basically understand how the landscape will take a completely different dimension. So you are not interacting then with things in the landscape, right? So the landscape is in fact a living being. And so you don't dominate it, you live with it. And so having this premise in mind, we can also start to see how territorial organization for Mesoamerican societies would have been then completely different. So the Altepetl, which was the form of spatial organization of the Nahua ethnic group to which the Aztec belonged, had not only a territorial dimension in terms of land division, but it also had social, political, cultural, ritual, and religious connotations. And when the Spanish arrived, they see the Aztec spatial organization and understand and translate the word Altepetl as town or city. But the word Altepetl is basically a combination of 2 of the most important concepts in Aztec cosmogony. Atl, which means water, and Tepetl, which means hill or mountain. But in order to understand the importance of this, I think we need to delve a bit further into the indigenous conception of the cosmos. So modern interpretations of the structure of the cosmos in the indigenous worldview basically suggest the existence of 3 interconnected spaces. There were the sky, the earth's surface, and then the underworld. And the sky had 13 levels and the underworld had 9, and deities could basically transit across these different levels. Now, the level of the earth was in the middle, and the surface was basically conceived, as I said before, as a being called by the Aztecs Zipactli, which was floating on water and that had reptilian characteristics. Now, some of her characteristics were that its back was corrugated, And this corresponded to the world's topography. So if you can see basically in the image, there is maize, corn basically growing out of the back of Zipactli, of this monster of the earth. And in the center, as the axis mundi, this is to say the axis of the world, there was a cosmic tree or a sacred mountain that connected these three realms and that enabled basically the transit of deities and men and the forces as well of nature through these different planes. So this earth monster was inhabited by humans, animals, plants, and natural phenomena as well, through which deities as well were present, right? So this creates a divine world where the sacred, but also the profane are basically intertwined, right? So going back to the word and the concept of the Altepetl, we can now understand that this refers to the aquatic realm and the earth realm in the form of the axis mundi. This is to say the sacred mountain containing water. Now, the mountain as the axis mundi was basically connected to the sea by springs, rivers, and subterranean water. And water, which was regarded as precious, came out from out of the mountain basically through caves that were conceived as liminal spaces and as entrances as well to the interior of the earth, right? In these spaces, such as caves, basically were it was where humans could get in touch with these other celestial and underworld realms, right? So each Altepetl replicated this model of the world. So this is to say that each human settlement belonged to a geographical Altepetl, which would generally be a hill or a high mountain, close to the town where people went and made offerings, performed rituals, and so on. And this is something that we observe all across central Mexico, but also in other areas of Mesoamerica as well. And if you have ever wondered why the Mesoamerican world built pyramids, it's because these are the architectural emulations of the sacred mountain, as I'm showing here. And we can find also the pictographic representations of these mountains, basically of Altepetl, in many codices and maps. And you can see in the screen some examples of this. And many times these show this rhomboidal pattern, basically, which is a representation of the skin of the monster of the earth. And it is, of course, quite telling as well that toponyms are, in effect, usually represented by this depiction of a mountain, accompanied sometimes by figures that will be used as phonetic transcription sometimes to represent the word of a toponym. And other times, the figures basically that accompany the mountain might represent geographical characteristics, as we see in the map of Zempoala to the right, and this might be representing basically characteristics close to the area that is talking about. So now that we understand that each Altepetl as a form of territorial, economic, religious, and social organization was the representation of the cosmos, we can then identify a series of components that reflect this idea in the real world. So each Altepetl had a territory, and it also had a deity related to both the economic activities carried out by people and to its mythical and historical origins as well. So these deities were worshipped in a temple that was the representation of the sacred mountain. And in consequence, this represented, as I was saying before, the center of the world, and therefore it was also where the political and the religious power also resided, right? And this analogy, as I said before, was not only conceptual. The temple had the form of a pyramid that basically emulated the sacred mountain. And even springs were sometimes built in some of them to represent the sacred water inside. Now, in the top of the pyramids were the temples, and these represented the entrance that were like caves. This is to say, the liminal spaces that I was mentioning before, through which the rulers, for instance, or the priests could make this connection with the entities in the celestial and the underworld levels. And this scene is actually one of the best representations of the confluence of the temple and the mountain as signs of the Altepetl. So this is a detail from page 14 of the Codex Borgia. And what you can observe on it is the depiction of the sacred mountain in the form of a pyramid. It has a temple on top, and you can see also the monster of the earth opening its mouth and is welcoming this character dressed as a deity called Tepeyolotl to walk inside. So this is to say that he's walking into this liminal space holding an offering in his hands. And in here, he will come in contact basically with the forces of nature. Now, as I said before, the Altepetl was the center of all power, and this means that it was profoundly connected to the ruler. So this connection is so strong that the representation of the Altepetl could be exchanged actually for that of the ruler. So in Mesoamerican representations, when they refer to a victory or a conquest, the image of the ruler actually represented the city as well. And this seems to be one of the reasons why Notoliniam, a Spanish priest that makes some of the first translations from Nahuatl to Spanish, he defines the Altepetl as the town, the city, the king. And the union between these two things happened at a mythical time and level. So this is to say that when the first ruler of the town makes an alliance with the deities, and these give him or her the power to control the resources of the territory, right? And at the same time, in exchange, the ruler also had to make offerings to them. So what this means, in effect, is that this connection between community and land is very much articulated in myth. And so the Altepetl reflected through a series of really interesting analogies and multiscalar replicas of the cosmos, as we can see in this figure, the indigenous concept of a space. And this was not simply a mappable geographical territory. It was the complex integration of this axis mundi, either mountains or temples, mythical sites, the ancestors, the presence of deities, but also the place that enabled the resources for the people's survival, right? And so the Altepetl, as we already said, was organized not only geographically, but also with a series of symbolic and ritual components. So for instance, an Altepetl could have constituent parts called calpolis or neighborhoods, and they could basically be organized, or they were usually related or organized in sacred numbers such as 4, 6, or 8, related basically to dualism. And each of their parts could be, it was normally of one ethnic affiliation, although there are indications that there is some foreign ethnicity in some cases, probably through marriage. Each guard within that were composed by 20, 40, 80, or 100 households. So here numbers were quite important. They had their own god, their own temple, and their own market. And each of them contributed to the general Altepetl in terms of products, tribute, taxes, war as well. And each of them had also a local leader, right? And all these calpolis were basically ruled by one main Tlatoani, the main Tlatoani of the Altepetl, right? Now, several Altepetl could also come together and form what has been called a way Altepetl. This is to say a great Altepetl. And this is in reality what the Spanish encounter and call the Aztec Empire when they arrive in 1519 to the center of Mexico. And in terms of geographies, the different calpolis that constituted the Altepetl, or the different Altepetl that composed a great Altepetl, didn't actually have to be geographically adjacent. So in some occasions, urban nucleation actually happened, but this didn't mean that this Altepetl was of more importance than others. And in addition to that, and this is quite important, there was a system of rotation that was of particular importance in terms of leadership and social organization. And this rotation was basically organized normally in relation to the lineage of the ruler of that particular either calpoli or Altepetl, right? And what this means was that, for example, in the case of a great Altepetl that was composed by several smaller Altepetl, each of them participated in tribute, again, tax collection, war, etc., but they took turns. And these turns, as I said before, were usually established by the lineage. And this system of rotation had a crucial importance in maintaining the order of the world as well. So a very important point is that because of this rotation system, there was no concept of the urban city as the center of the Altepetl organization. So this is substantially different from the European conceptions of urban and rural and of territorial organization as well. So when the Spanish arrive, they encounter urbanized areas and they immediately equate these as the most important centers, right? So they call these cabeceras, this is to say head or main towns or cities, and every other settlement will be sujetos, this is to say subjects, right, to the other. And what this provokes in practice is that they impose basically a hierarchical structure that makes huge damage because the indigenous system is not only organizational and economic, as we have already explained, but it's also social, religious, and is profoundly related to the ways of conceiving as well the world. So all what we know in terms of the Altepetl that I have been explaining here so far comes from the careful analysis of historical documents that have been carried out by fantastic historians like James Lockhart, Pedro Carrasco, Federico Fernandez Chrysler, among many others, right? But the great difficulty in the analysis of the sources in general is that when it comes to the archaeological record, there has been little that we have been able to match between what the historical record says and what the archaeological record shows. So this is to say that the historical records that have been particularly studied in the case of places that have been centers of indigenous power, particularly in central Mexico, and that were of deep importance for the Spanish Empire, such as Texcoco, Cholula, Tlaxcala, and of course Tenochtitlan, strongly suggest that the Spanish rely on the territorial organization that had existed previously in order to get tribute and all the riches that these regions generated. So it has been argued, and rightly so, because the historical documents seem to demonstrate so, that not much changes in terms of territorial organization and therefore in settlement pattern. But many times, the archaeological record, particularly outside of these very well-documented cases, seem to suggest profound changes. And we have to take into account as well that there are other really important events that might have disrupted profoundly this organization. And these are, of course, epidemics that happen across the 16th century, which means that the centers of population are not only abandoned, but people just died by the thousands. And of course, the introduction of Christianity as the new religion and the needs to evangelize people that tend to be scattered in the landscape, because as I said before, they could belong to an Altepetl, but this didn't mean that that they cluster together, right? And so this means that policies like the Congregaciones de Indios, the reductions where indigenous populations were ordered to move into a single location in order to evangelize them, were put in place. And many times ethnic groups, for instance, that were originally enemies were put together. And so this created all sorts of problems, displacements, and so on. So we have that in the first 30 years after the fall of the Aztec Empire, the indigenous organization and many places have certainly remained the same, but many other places particularly have been renamed, they have disappeared, the population has been displaced, towns have been abandoned, and so on, right? And the scale in which this happened has really never been studied in depth before. So on one hand, we have strong evidence of the settlement patterns that Mesoamerican societies had before the arrival of the Spanish, and the National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico has recorded the majority of this evidence in a geographic information system format. But up to our project, there has never been an attempt to map those places that are mentioned in historical sources for the colonial period and actually to carry out a comparison between these two. So this is to say that the Mesoamerican settlement pattern and the colonial settlement pattern haven't been compared at all at a larger scale before. And this could, of course, give us a clear picture of how settlement pattern changes or not, and the introduction, particularly with the introduction of the Spanish system. So The Digging into Early Colonial Mexico project had many different objectives. And in general, we wanted to develop computational approaches to study these things. But in particular, we wanted to address this enormous issue, right? And the way of doing that was through the creation of the first 16th century digital historical gazetteer of New Spain. So the £1 million question was how to tackle this, right? And luckily, we have a massive historical source, and I mean massive for historical standards, called the Geographic Reports of New Spain. And so this is a 16th century questionnaire that the King of Spain at the time, Philip II, orders to every single town and city in the Spanish territory, and compiles all sorts of different information in terms of religion, culture, economy, geographies, of course, and so on. And in the case of Mexico and Guatemala, it compiles, as I said, an enormous amount of information that covers the area that you can see in the screen. And so it gathers information from thousands of provinces, well, hundreds of provinces, cabeceras, towns, villages, and so on. Now, we knew that we had to confront mainly two important challenges at the beginning. The first one is called linguistic disambiguation, and the second one is called geographic disambiguation. So this is to say that we have to identify the place names, understand if they have changed over time, and if they had any correspondence to modern place names to begin with. And in the case of geographic disambiguation, this basically refers to the task of finding the correct coordinates, right, for such place names. Now, both of these, if you are not familiar with them, sound easy, but they are massive tasks on their own, right? And we thought very optimistically, I think at that time, that we could actually tackle this through automatic means, at least to a certain extent, right? And we did manage some bits, but not everything. And in fact, most of the work was actually carried out through quite intensive research. So we made use of three main types of sources. Firstly, we used 16th century primary sources, which were at the end the ones that we wanted to create the Gazetteer for. These were the 10 volumes of the Relaciones Geográficas of 16th century edited by René Acuña, the 2 volumes of Relaciones Geográficas from Yucatán edited by Mercedes de la Garza, and another volume of the Papeles de la Nueva España called La Suma de la Visita de los Pueblos, edited by Francisco del Paso y Troncoso, which basically is 1 volume. We also used very important secondary sources, particularly iconic studies of historical geography. And these were mainly four main sources. One was the Geografía Económica de México by Alejandra Moreno Toscano, the work by Peter Gerard, and a fantastic resource called AGIS de las Indias that basically compiled particularly sites for the 18th century. This is a fantastic resource, but you know, as I was saying before, some places remain, some others not. So all these sources were really, really useful at all levels. And finally, we made use also of modern sources of toponymy, and this included all the sources that you see in the screen. This went from the Heritage and Monument records from the National Institute of Anthropology and History, the modern databases from the Geographic Institute in Mexico, and so on. So in the first step, we used the indexes of the primary and the secondary sources to extract place name information. So we went from PDFs to running text using basically OCR. Of course, involved on these, we had to do all sorts of cleaning. And we ended up with a series of tables for each volume with these massive indexes, right? Now, from there, we confronted the list of place names against each of the modern gazetteers first, and then from these 2 possibilities emerged, right? If the place name match, this was recorded, and then a new record with this information from both the modern and historical place name was created. And this was as far actually as the automated process went. Because although, of course, many of the place names remain the same, there is no way to automatically 100% make sure that the matches are actually correct. And as another complication to that, there are spelling variations as well, right? So we had to investigate those. And so even when we found the matches, and these expedited very much the process, we still had to review every single place manually. And this was also the case, of course, if a place name was not really found, right? But from this, we had a very good starting point to work with. So at this stage, each toponym then was manually revisited and then contrasted with the original information and assigned coordinates. And at this point, it was actually quite common to have several coordinates attributed to the same place name, of course. This is a common problem as well in historical gazetteers, and or in gazetteers in general. And here, the work of historical geographies were massively important because in many cases, this gave us not only the precise historical locations, but also all sorts of place name variations that we also recorded. So a series of fields were basically recorded in these tables for each of the 14 historical primary sources. And this included the place name in the spelling that appear in the primary source, alternative names as well, the modern name, a confidence index. So we assign a number 1 if we consider the location to be 100% accurate, or a number 2 if the location was only approximate. And we also recorded the type of settlements according to the Spanish colonial definition. And this is to say whether these had any relationship as well with other places. So if they were subject to another place, so what we call cabeceras and sujetos, villages and so on, right? And we also recorded other useful information, including the references that we have used to disambiguate all this. Now, if the automatically assigned coordinates did not correspond to the original location, or we had, the suspicion of that, the place name was basically sent to another list that was the closed research data list. And from there, a more intensive process of research will take place. So we will make use of all sorts of resources, particularly modern historical and historical research, in order to do the geographic disambiguation. And so once information was in place, the final result was on a spreadsheet basically that contained the coordinates and all the relevant information for the notes section, the bibliographical references, and so on. Now, from this process, we collected then all the place names that were mentioned only in the historical primary sources. And then we recorded as well the page number, for instance, where they occur in the dicted version of the primary sources. And from this, we then created the 16th century Gazetteer, right? Now, in this table, basically, as you can basically see the disambiguation results. So in the, So in the primary, in this column, we basically recorded all the primary sources by volume, and then the secondary sources as well by volume, the total of toponyms that they contain, and the number of toponyms that we achieve the disambiguation from each volume, and then the percentage of disambiguation per volume as well. And as you can see, we achieved quite remarkable percentage of disambiguation for the majority of sources, where at least 5 of them, 6 of them, sorry, we achieved 100% of disambiguation of toponyms for all of these sources. And the results of this now are a series of things, right? So we created a general gazetteer of New Spain, which is in effect a digital directory of historical places of Mexico and Guatemala, as well from primary sources, as well as information collected from quite comprehensive studies on political, religious, and the administrative units as well of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. And we also created this subset that I was talking about, the DECM, the beginning to early colonial Mexico 16th century Gazetteer, which includes only the toponyms that are mentioned in the primary sources that I was talking about directly, so the Relaciones Geográficas and the Suma de la Visita de los Pueblos. And this data set is also accompanied by 71 main files with geographic information on colonial jurisdictions. So these are provincias, alcaldías, corregimientos, and dioceses, among many others. And also 30 tables with additional information related to languages, repositories, maps, and so on that relate basically to this information, to the primary information as well. And so all these is now available in shapefiles to use in a geographic information system format, but we are also in the process of finishing an online database with all this information with an interoperable model. This is the linked places format, because as probably you know, the work with historical gazetteers do not really end, right? And we will continue to grow this resource in the foreseeable future. So coming back to the reasons why we wanted to create this resource, I have to say I'm super excited. I'm absolutely thrilled because we have now the means to address the historical issues that I explained at the beginning. And of course, with the volume of data that we have now, I think this will take us years, not only of spatial analysis, but also good old historical archaeology research. But we have now created at least the basis for which Mesoamericanists and Latin American scholars can carry out spatial analysis or spatial research that will, in my opinion, undoubtedly lead to new discoveries as well. Now, just to finish, if you ask me after these 3 years that the project, well, 3 years and because of COVID and so on, got extended until September of this year, what I will have done different after all this time. Probably the biggest change that I will do is to do more with the, from the very beginning with natural language processing. So many of you might be thinking why you didn't use natural, name entity recognition, right, from the very beginning. And at some point I did think about it, but because the majority of these place names are in one of the 69 different indigenous languages at the time in Mexico, I found it will prove quite difficult to start from there. And now experience have actually shown me that it is probably better working with non-European languages to invest time in training machine learning models to identify these entities. And in our case, we are now working with our industry partner, TACTOC, in training models for this. So next time, right? But there is still much work to do in relation to NLP and so on as well. And just to finish, all these data sets will be freely available at the end of this year. And there are many other things that we have created in the context of this project, including an annotated historical corpus of data from these relaciones and so on, and also a software for geographical text analysis. But anyway, thanks, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Patricia. It's fascinating.
So if there is any questions,
you can say it orally, or maybe if you prefer to write them in the chat. So for Patricia, I just wanted to, while people think about some question, I wanted to say that I'm thrilled about this project because it's for my point of view, it's a model project of creating Gazetteer with automated process. And I think that this is important, the feedback that you are giving to the community is very important, because if we want to create more historical data about place names, we would need to deal with all of the things that you just showed. So this is a great project.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think the steps that we took, we had very much in consideration or in mind precisely that at the very beginning we couldn't find that much experience around, although I know there is of course some, but there was no directly, a manual or something that we could say, okay, so this is the direction to take, or this is a direction not to take, because we also in the process learned things that we shouldn't have done and that we might have, wasted time on doing those things while we could do something else, right? So, so yeah, it was a really steep learning curve in that sense, but it was definitely worth it. I mean, one of the things that I have to say is that these projects, I mean, in terms of the creation of the actual Gazetteer, it sounds pedantic, but it's really not. I'm saying this with all the humbleness that I can. This data set will truly change, the studies of this will truly change our perception of settlement pattern. And so it has lots of potential. So the massive effort is worth it. And of course, I have to also say that this is a collective effort. This is not my effort. All the team, the fantastic postdocs that we have in the project, Raquel Liceras and Mariana Favila, for instance, Catherine Bellamy, my PhD student, and of course the other PIs with me, Bruno Martins and Diego Jimenez Vadillo, were of crucial importance, and Ian Gregory as well was a great, help in terms of advice and so on. So yeah, I think it is an interesting process just to learn about, but it's also an important data set now to have.
Yes, of course. Thank you again. There is a question for you, Patty, in the chat. I can read it for you if you like.
Yes, please, because I'm not quite sure how to answer.
Sure. So, to which extent computer science techniques should be revisited to address digital humanities problem that you address in your project?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think more than revisited, I guess, is more tailoring, right? Because I think the majority of computational approaches that we use in digital humanities particularly come from data sets with modern experience, right? So in this particular case, for instance, we can think of natural language processing or even OCR, right? Optical character recognition is great for modern European languages and, modern sources. It works like a charm in many cases. But when we start going back in time and we start, dealing with handwritten documents and we start dealing with old languages or a mix of languages, in this case, for instance, all the Spanish with 69 different, indigenous languages as well, then NLP, it just doesn't really work that well. So we need to revisit, certainly. We need to revisit all these in terms at least of tailoring them for our own purposes. And at the same time, there is really exciting, I think, research that can emerge from this. And I know that this is not particular to historical research, but for instance, work with trying to sort out strings, right? String matching, for instance, for toponyms. It is, for instance, quite a computational, relevant and interesting technique that could allow us to sort out problems in terms of spelling variations, right? And so this is an area of research that it has been exploited, I think, in particular modern contexts, but not necessarily in historical cases. And sometimes it does not necessarily apply in the same way from one language to another and so on. So there are so many different things that we can do with computational approaches, but we certainly need to work with our friends in computer science to tailor these. Yeah.
There is another question. So you introduced your presentation by saying that you couldn't find guidelines to help you in this remarkable research. Have you or will you write one to help other researchers? How are you planning to document the process?
Yes, definitely. We did. With this in mind precisely, we documented the whole process. So we have, we are working now in the final stages, basically, of this document, and it is basically a manual of how we created this Gazetteer, but it points out not only the process, but also what are the most common problems that you might encounter. And I am also open, to talking with people. I don't have any problem if you send me an email and say, oh, how do you think I should approach this and that? And I will try to advise you at my best, right? Yes, we are going to release all these guidelines at the end of this year with all the data sets and so on. We are, as I said, just finishing now the process